Have you ever gotten a batch of survey responses back and you just get that feeling like, did people actually even read the questions?
Yeah,
Or were they just clicking through? You know what I mean?
absolutely. Especially online surveys these days. I mean, it makes you wonder how much we can really trust the data.
Totally. It's
Yeah,
like this fundamental challenge of making sure we're actually capturing what people think and not just random clicks or, someone rushing through.
exactly. And that's a huge problem for research, right? Because if we're basing our theories or decisions on data that's full of noise, well, the conclusions we draw are going to be shaky at best.
For sure. So that's what we're going to dig into today. This whole problem of what researchers call careless responding and how it can really mess with our attempts to understand things through surveys.
And we've got a really interesting article here from Organizational Research Methods that tackles this head on. They actually present a brand new method for detecting careless responding, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, this Laz.R method is really intriguing. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down how Laz.R works and why it's such a big deal for anyone who uses surveys or relies on survey data for, making decisions.
Sounds good. Let's jump in.
All right, so let's start with the basics. What exactly do we mean by careless responding? It seems like there could be a few different ways to be careless in a survey.
Right. Well, the article uses a bunch of different terms, actually. They talk about careless responding, random responding, insufficient effort responding, inattentive responding. But basically, it all boils down to this. Someone's not really engaging with the survey questions the way they should be.
So it's not just like accidentally clicking the wrong answer. It's more about a general lack of effort or attention.
Yeah. And the problem is that can have a ripple effect on the data. Like imagine you're trying to measure something like job satisfaction.
Hmm.
A bunch of your respondents are just clicking randomly or picking the same answer for every question.
Right, it's going to skew your results.
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to get an accurate picture of actual job satisfaction. And it goes even deeper than that. Like the article talks about how careless responding can mess with things like the correlations between different variables or the factor structure of a scale.
So it's not just about individual answers being wrong. It can actually distort the relationships we see between different concepts.
Yeah, and that's a big problem because a lot of research is about understanding those relationships. And if our data is contaminated with careless responses, it can lead to some pretty misleading conclusions.
That makes sense. And the article also mentions different types of careless responding, right? It's not all just random clicking.
Yeah, so they talk about random responding, which is, pretty self-explanatory, but they also talk about non-random patterned responding. So that's where someone's answers follow a predictable pattern, even though it's not related to the content of the questions.
Like if someone just picks the middle option for every question.
Exactly. That's called straight lining. Or they might do a seesaw pattern where they alternate between high and low responses.
Or even like a diagonal pattern, going up 1 point on the scale for each question.
Yeah, all sorts of variations. And the thing is, these patterns can be really subtle. So it's not always easy to spot them just by looking at the data.
So how widespread is this problem? I mean, is this something that researchers should really be worried about?
The article cites studies showing that careless responding can occur in anywhere from 3.5% of responses to over 50%, depending on the survey and the population.
Wow, over 50% in some cases. That's a huge chunk of potentially unreliable data.
Yeah, it's definitely something to take seriously. And with online surveys becoming more and more common, the problem's only getting worse.
Right, because it's easier to just click through an online survey without really paying attention.
Exactly. So what do researchers do about this? I mean, how can we identify and deal with careless responding?
Yeah, that's the big question. The article talks about different approaches, right?
Yeah, they break it down into two main categories: precautionary measures and post hoc methods.
So precautionary measures are things you build into the survey itself to try to prevent careless responding in the first place.
Right, like setting a time limit for completing the survey so people can't rush through it too quickly.
Or including attention check questions where the answer is super obvious to see if people are paying attention.
Yeah, those are good examples.
Mm-hmm.
They also talk about things like instructed response items, where you literally tell participants to choose a specific answer option just to make sure they're following instructions.
Okay, so those all sound kind of clever, but I can see how they might have some downsides too.
Yeah, for sure. The article points out that some participants might find those precautionary measures annoying or even insulting.
Especially if they're actually putting effort into the survey.
Exactly. And people who take a lot of surveys might start to recognize those attention check questions and just, learn how to get around them.
So they're not foolproof?
Nope. And of course, if you're working with existing data, you can't go back and add those precautionary measures.
Right. So that's where the post hoc methods come in. These are the techniques you use to identify careless responding after the data has already been collected.
Exactly. So the article goes through a bunch of these methods, like the long string index, which looks for long strings of identical answers.
So if someone just keeps picking strongly agree for everything.
Exactly. That would get flagged by the long string index. Then there's Mahalanobis distance, which identifies unusual response patterns that are statistically unlikely given the overall distribution of the data.
Okay, so that one's looking for outliers, basically.
Right. And then there's inter-individual response variability, or IRV, which basically measures how much an individual's responses vary across the different items in the survey.
So someone with low IRV would have pretty consistent answers across the board, even if those answers don't really make sense.
Exactly. And then there are methods that look for inconsistencies between responses to items that should be related. Like if you have two questions that are basically measuring the same thing, but someone answers them in completely opposite ways.
That would be a red flag.
Yeah. And finally, there are methods based on item response theory, which is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
But basically, they try to model how likely someone is to give a certain response based on their underlying trait level.
So if someone's responses don't fit that model, it could be a sign of careless responding.
Exactly. So there are a lot of different methods out there, but the article argues that they all have limitations.
Right. So that's where this new method, LazR, comes in. What makes LazR different and potentially better than these other methods?
Well, one of the key advantages of LazR is that it's specifically designed to detect non-random pattern responding, like those straight lining and seesaw patterns we were talking about earlier.
Which some of the other methods struggle with.
Yeah, exactly. Like the long string index is great for detecting straight lining, but it misses seesaw patterns. And Mahalanobis distance can sometimes flag legitimate outliers as being careless responders.
So LazR is more sensitive to those subtle patterns of carelessness.
And it's also really good at differentiating between those patterns and random responding, which is something that a lot of the other methods have trouble with.
So it's more precise in a way.
Yeah, and another cool thing about LazR is that it's based on this idea of Markov chains.
Markov chains, I vaguely remember that from statistics class, but refresh my memory.
So basically, a Markov chain is a way of modeling a sequence of events where the probability of each event depends only on the state of the previous event.
Okay, so the past predicts the future, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And in the context of careless responding, it means that if someone's just clicking through a survey without really thinking, their previous answer is going to be a pretty good predictor of their next answer, regardless of what the question is actually asking.
So LazR is looking for that predictability in someone's responses.
Right. It's quantifying how much someone's response patterns are driven by that kind of mindless repetition rather than genuine engagement with the survey items.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So how does LazR actually work? What's the calculation involved?
So it's a three-step process. The first step is to create something called a transition matrix, which basically tracks how often each response option is followed by every other response option for a given individual.
Okay, so if we have a 4-point scale, it's going to count how many times someone went from a 1 to a 2 or from a 3 to a 4 and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So you end up with this matrix of transition counts for each person.
And what's the second step?
The second step is to turn that transition matrix into a transition probability matrix. So basically, you're taking those raw counts and converting them into probabilities.
So instead of knowing how many times someone went from a 1 to a 2, the likelihood of them making that transition.
Exactly. And then the third and final step is to calculate the Laz.R score itself, which is done by multiplying the probabilities in the transition probability matrix by the corresponding counts in the transition matrix, summing up all those products, and then dividing by the total number of transitions.
Okay, so it's a bit of a mouthful. But the basic idea is that the higher the Laz.R score, the more predictable someone's response sequence is, and the more likely they are to be a careless responder.
Right. And the article gives a nice example of this. They talk about a guy named John who's using a really obvious pattern in his responses. He's just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1 over and over again.
So like a seesaw pattern, but with all the response options?
Yeah. And his Laz.R score ends up being 0.67, which is really high. It indicates that his responses are super predictable and almost certainly not based on the actual content of the questions.
That makes sense. So it sounds like LazR has a lot of potential, but does it actually work in practice? I mean, do we have evidence that it's actually effective at identifying careless responders?
Yeah, the article presents a bunch of empirical evidence to support the validity of LazR. They conducted several studies using both real-world data and simulated data.
And what did they find?
So one of the key findings was that people with high LazR scores tended to show weaker discriminant validity between different constructs.
Discriminant validity. That's the idea that different constructs should be distinct from each other, right?
Exactly. Like if you're measuring extroversion and conscientiousness, those two traits should be relatively independent of each other.
Right. Someone can be high in one and low in the other, or vice versa.
Exactly. But what they found was that in people with high LazR scores, those two traits were more strongly correlated than they should be.
So their careless responding was kind of blurring the lines between different constructs.
Yeah, exactly. And they found similar results in a study using Holland's Ariasek model, which is a model of vocational interests.
So it seems like LazR is picking up on something real. It's identifying people whose data is less reliable because of their careless responding.
Right. And they also did a study where they specifically compared LazR to those other post hoc methods we were talking about earlier.
And how did it stack up?
It actually outperformed all the other methods in terms of detecting those predefined careless response patterns like straight lining and seesaw patterns.
Wow. So it's really good at picking up on those systematic patterns of carelessness.
Yeah. But they did find that it wasn't as good at detecting random responding.
So it's not a perfect solution.
No method is, but it's a really valuable tool for identifying those specific types of non-random pattern responses.
That makes sense. And they also compared LazR to those precautionary measures, right? Like the attention check questions.
Yeah, and they found that there was surprisingly little agreement between LazR and those precautionary measures.
Really?
Yeah.
So even if someone fails an attention check question, they might still have a low LazR score.
Exactly, or vice versa.
Yeah.
It suggests that those different methods are tapping into different aspects of careless responding.
So it's important to use a combination of methods to get a more complete picture.
Right, and they actually found that relying solely on those precautionary measures can miss a lot of cases of careless responding.
So adding LazR to the mix can really improve our ability to identify and deal with this problem.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's say we've calculated LazR scores for our data. How do we actually decide who to flag as a careless responder? I mean, is there a specific cutoff score?
That's a good question. And the article talks about how setting cutoffs for LazR can be tricky because the prevalence of careless responding can vary a lot across different samples and populations.
So a universal cutoff wouldn't really make sense.
Right, exactly. So they recommend using a data-driven approach to determine the cutoff for each specific data set.
And how do you do that?
Well, they suggest looking for a knee in the distribution of LazR scores. When you plot the scores from highest to lowest, there's often a point where the slope of the line changes dramatically.
So it's like a sharp drop off.
Yeah, exactly. And that knee point can be a good indicator of where the careless responders start to separate from the more careful responders.
Okay, so you're looking for that natural breaking point in the data.
Right. And to make this process more objective, they recommend using a statistical algorithm called the needle algorithm, which can automatically detect that knee point.
So it takes the guesswork out of it?
Exactly.
That's really helpful. So to wrap things up, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive? What are the key things that researchers should keep in mind when it comes to careless responding and LazR?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that careless responding is a serious issue that can really compromise the validity of our research findings.
It's not something we can just ignore.
Nope. And LazR is a powerful new tool that can help us detect and address this problem more effectively than ever before.
Especially those patterned responses that can be really hard to spot otherwise.
Exactly. And I think it's important to emphasize that LazR isn't a magic bullet. It's not going to solve all our problems with data quality, but it's a really valuable addition to our toolkit.
And when used in combination with other methods, both precautionary and post-hoc, it can significantly improve the reliability of our data and the trustworthiness of our conclusions. So for anyone out there who's working with survey data, I highly recommend checking out the original article in Organizational Research Methods and exploring the R Shiny app that the authors have developed. It's a great resource for learning more about LazR and other techniques for detecting careless responding.
Definitely. And I think it's important to remember that careless responding isn't just a problem for researchers. It affects anyone who uses survey data to make decisions.
Right. So if you're a manager or a policymaker or anyone who relies on surveys to understand people's attitudes and behaviors, you need to be aware of this issue and the tools that are available to address it.
And on that note, I'd like to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. If you knew that a certain percentage of your survey data was unreliable, how would that change the way you interpret and use that data? What steps would you take to ensure that you're making decisions based on the most accurate information possible?
That's a great question to ponder. And I encourage everyone to think critically about the surveys they encounter, both as respondents and as consumers of data.
Because ultimately, the quality of our data determines the quality of our understanding.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.